Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Incredible Hulk 4, cover dated November of 1962. This issue marks the first appearance of obscure alien warrior, Mongu, and was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby. Our issue opens up with a striking splash panel, showing Rick Jones as he's adjusting a complex machine over the Hulk, which he hopes will permanently turn him back into Bruce Banner. But to understand who Rick is, and what's going on, we must travel back several days, and into the mind of Betty Ross. She's thinking back to the day that she first met Dr. Bruce Banner, the lead scientist on the Army's Gamma Bomb project, which was overseen by her father, General Thunderbolt Ross. She remembers being delighted to meet a scientist who was as young and as handsome as Bruce. Yet it seems that much of this vitality was lost when he exposed himself to an experimental gamma bomb detonation in an attempt to save the life of teenager Rick Jones, who had carelessly wandered onto the testing range. And while the bomb should have killed him, he miraculously survived. But Betty could tell that it had still changed him, as though he now carried within him a frightening secret. But she couldn't worry about it for long, as Bruce's accident happened to coincide with the emergence of the Hulk, a powerful monster with a particular affinity for her. While we of course know that the Hulk and Bruce are one and the same, Betty, nor anyone other than Rick knows the truth. To her credit though, she's noticed that Rick, the only person who's friends with the Hulk, was also close with Bruce. Thus she wonders if there's a connection between the two, as Bruce has apparently been missing for some time. So she goes to her father, and tells him that if they find Rick, they may be able to learn what happened to Bruce. But all he cares about is destroying the Hulk, so he ignores her, and instead pays attention to the launch of an experimental new weapon, the iceberg rocket. But just before the rocket's about to launch, the Hulk leaps in from out of nowhere. Except it's not actually the Hulk, but a robotic copy, acting as a lifelike target for the iceberg rocket. Thus as planned, the rocket launches and intercepts the robot. But instead of exploding, it releases a cloud of gas which engulfs the Hulkbot, and then quickly solidifies into a block of ice. This block then crashes to the ground, but it, and the robot inside, remain intact. With the test over, and a resounding success, General Ross finally listens to what his daughter has to say. At first he disregards her plea, as he can't be bothered to look for Bruce, who he doesn't even like. But once she reminds him how close Rick is to the Hulk, he changes his mind, and makes finding the teenager his top priority. So his men start scouring the area around their base, and eventually stumble onto a desolate cabin. Unbeknownst to them, it's actually where Rick and the Hulk have been hiding. But before we go any further, it should be noted that after a bizarre accident in the last issue, the Hulk's currently beholden to Rick's every command. Thus when Rick spots the soldiers outside the cabin, he orders the Hulk to flee. Obeying without question, the Jade Giant mightily leaps out of the cabin, and crashes through a wall in the process. While Rick could have just jumped on the Hulk's back and escaped with him, for some reason he allows himself to be captured by the soldiers. Yet even though the Hulk has just torn through an entire wall, none of them notice him leaving, or realize that he was ever there. Regardless, the soldiers then take Rick to General Ross, who tries to force information out of the teenager. But Rick refuses to say anything, and although he hasn't been accused of any crime, gets sent to an army prison. Meanwhile, the Hulk's still aimlessly leaping away from the cabin, although he's gotten far enough from Rick to be free from his mental control. Thus when he spots a school bus stuck on railroad tracks, a tiny spark of Bruce Banner comes to life, and he instinctively pushes it out of the way of a speeding train. Once he's sure all the kids are safe, he leaves, and continues wandering the desert. Eventually he stumbles onto a live movie set, and for seemingly no reason at all, destroys a bunch of filming equipment. He then heads to the production studio's cafeteria, and demands that they give him food. Of course everyone just flees in terror, so the Hulk helps himself to an entire pot of what looks like soup. But eventually the panic subsides, and the film's director realizes that with the Hulk, he could make the greatest monster movie of all time. So he orders his crew to capture the Hulk, and in response, the Green Goliath mightily claps his hands above his head. This thunderclap produces a sonic boom and knocks all of the crewmen to the ground. Apparently only there for the soup, the Hulk then leaps away, and eventually finds himself in the heart of a major city. While aimlessly hopping from skyscraper to skyscraper, he receives a mental distress call from Rick. Following its psychic trail, he finds his friend as he's being transported to the army prison by armed guards. So he snatches Rick away from them, and then leaps away. Following Rick's commands, the Hulk eventually lands at the opening of a desert cave. Although you couldn't tell from its entrance, it's actually a secret laboratory built by Bruce Banner. Among its many devices is one which may be able to turn the Hulk back into Bruce. While it's unclear if it actually works, and Rick can't understand its complex instructions, he decides to use it on the Hulk anyways, as the alternative is being accused of Bruce's murder and sent to prison. So he commands the Hulk to lie down on a steel table, and then activates Bruce's machine. It bombards the Jade Giant with a torrent of gamma radiation, and slowly reverts him back to Bruce Banner. Thus an elated Rick shuts it off, but finds that he'd waited too long, and has accidentally exposed his friend to too much radiation. While the radiation doesn't affect Bruce's transformation, it does leave him feeble and weak. So Rick ushers Bruce into a wheelchair, and then apologizes for flubbing the experiment. Bruce tells him that it's not his fault, and that he's just grateful to be himself again. But even still, he knows that with his rather precarious situation, he can't afford to be feeble for long. Thus an idea pops into his head, as he wonders if he can use his machine to combine the Hulk's strength with his own intelligence. With only one way to find out, Bruce adjusts his machine settings, and then forces a transformation back into the Hulk. Somehow this process frees the Hulk from Rick's mind control, as while ignoring the teenager's commands, he breaks free of the machine and begins lurching towards him. But just as it seems that he's going to pound the teenager, he reveals that he's actually Dr. Banner. Or so it seems. In truth, it's not that Bruce's mind has replaced that of the Hulk's, but that the two have become merged into one. Thus while Bruce has indeed gained the power of the Hulk, he's also gained his rage and savagery. But this doesn't mean that he's incapable of good, as a short while later, he and Rick leave the cave, and notice a blazing cabin in the distance. Peering inside, Bruce spots a family about to perish. So without a second thought, he grabs the section of the cabin that's on fire, and then mightily hurls it away. He then greets the family he'd just saved, but instead of being grateful, they scream in terror. Their cries attract the attention of a local sheriff's deputy, who recognizes Bruce as the monster he'd heard about on the radio. Not willing to believe that such a creature could be intelligent, he immediately pulls out his rifle and opens fire on Bruce. So the green genius grabs Rick and leaps away, as just like his more brutish self, he's tired of being shot at and hounded. Bruce takes Rick back to the secret laboratory, and then allows himself to be depowered. Yet the constant transformations are taking their toll on him, as he's once again tired and weak. So he heads to bed, aware that even in the Hulk's body, he's still not fully in control. That concludes this issue's first story. The second opens up with a striking splash page, showing a strange alien spaceship as it's preparing to land on Earth. Thus on the next page we see it do just that, as it lands in the middle of a park, within the city from the previous story. As a small crowd begins to gather around the ship, a menacing alien emerges from within, and announces himself as Mongu. He declares that he's come from a world of alien warriors, and is here to challenge Earth's mightiest mortal in hand-to-hand combat. If he loses the match, he promises to depart and never return. But if he wins, he'll signal his people to invade. Whoever takes up his challenge must meet him in the Grand Canyon by sundown. If none have arrived by then, he'll signal his people to invade. With that, Mongu climbs back into his spaceship, and departs for the Grand Canyon. Luckily his challenge has been televised, and thus Bruce and Rick have seen it from their hidden laboratory. Knowing that he may be the only one who can defeat Mongu, Bruce rushes over to his machine and transforms himself back into the Hulk. He and Rick then board a jet plane they somehow got a hold of, and head off for the Grand Canyon. Spotting Mongu's spaceship, the two land and confront the alien. But to their surprise, he's been expecting them. Thus to make their fight more fair, Mongu gives the Hulk a large axe, just like the one he's holding. But when the Hulk takes the axe, he quickly realizes that it's nothing more than cardboard. To make matters even more confusing, a squad of Soviet soldiers then emerge from Mongu's ship, and surround the Hulk and Rick. It turns out that Mongu isn't actually an alien warrior, but a Soviet named Boris Monguski, who'd been wearing a mechanical suit. Apparently this whole thing has been an elaborate ruse to lure out and then capture the Hulk, so Soviet scientists can study him, and then create an army of gamma-powered super soldiers. Of course the Hulk can't let that happen, so with astonishing speed, he leaps high into the air, and then pounds on the ground as he lands. Striking the earth like meteors, his fists produce a massive explosion that sends the surrounding soldiers flying. As the Soviets get back to their feet, the Hulk rounds up their weapons and crushes them. But one of the soldiers still has a grenade, which he then hurls at the Hulk. In an astounding feat of strength, the Hulk catches the grenade, and then lets it explode in his hand. Incredibly, he's left completely unharmed. But the Soviets aren't completely defenseless, as within their so-called spaceship is a sonic cannon. Although it's harmless to ordinary humans, the noise it produces is torturous to the Hulk's supersensitive ears. Thus when he's hit, he desperately burrows underground to escape the sonic blast. Like a gopher, he then digs a tunnel underneath the ship, and mightily bursts his way through. As he then tears the whole thing apart, he realizes that it's not an actual spaceship, but of course just an ordinary fighter jet that's been disguised. Yet while it seems that the Soviets have been defeated, they've still got an ace in the hole. They've captured Rick, and warn the Hulk that unless he surrenders, they'll kill him. At first the Hulk scoffs at their threat, as he knows that without their spaceship they're stranded, and hurting Rick won't do anything to help them escape. But the Hulk's wrong, as the Soviets reveal that they've got a helicopter they'd been hiding this whole time. So the Hulk simply grabs a piece of debris from the wrecked spaceship, and hurls it at the helicopter. Instead of destroying the entire thing, he merely severs the craft's landing gear, thereby making a landing impossible. Realizing that they're now actually trapped, the Soviets surrender to the Hulk, and free Rick. So the Jade Giant rounds them up, ties them together with their belts, and then attaches them to their helicopter. He then lets them go, but promises to be less merciful if they ever return. A few hours later, General Ross's men arrive at the scene of the would-be battle between Mongu and Hulk. Like the Green Goliath before them, they discover that Mongu was just a mechanical suit, and his spaceship was just a Soviet jet fighter in disguise. Yet when they find evidence that the Hulk had been there, they conclude that he'd orchestrated the hoax to make himself look like a hero. So that's the official story printed in the next day's paper, turning an already hateful public against the Hulk even more. As for the Jade Giant himself, well, he's just used his machine to turn back into Bruce Banner. And like before, he's left tired and weak. Thus the issue ends as Rick ushers Bruce to bed, to get some rest before their next adventure. While that concludes our story for today, Marvel has also included a letter page. It was actually printed in the middle of the issue, but I've decided to showcase it at the end for today's video. For those unaware, letter pages were once hallmarks of the comics industry in an age before the internet. They gave Marvel an opportunity to respond to the praise, criticism, and suggestions they'd received about their stories. All of the letters presented in this issue were sent by mail to Marvel over 60 years ago, and cover up to the Incredible Hulk 2. While I will not be reading the letter page aloud, please take a moment to look and see what readers of the time thought of this series. It's certainly an interesting experience all these years later. And with that, we've concluded The Incredible Hulk 4, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a fairly solid story, although not quite as exciting as the previous few. The first story in particular was rather dull at times, as we got yet another retelling of the Hulk's origin, and it was pretty light on action. Something that I did appreciate is that Rick's no longer in control of the Hulk. As I noted in my review of the last issue, I thought the whole point of the Hulk was that he's supposed to be an uncontrollable monster. By making him Rick's puppet, you're removing the thing that makes him unique amongst heroes. Thus I'm glad that this issue returned him back to normal. Except it didn't, as he's now been merged with Bruce's intelligence. Once again, this seems rather counter to what makes the Hulk unique, and thus while I'm interested to see how it plays out, I honestly hope that it fades away sooner rather than later. As for the second story, I found it to be a fun but rather generic adventure. While I don't have any particular issue with it, I just wish it had a bit more impact on the wider story. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.